Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. We saw in the last episode how a number of political parties emerged in Austria over the course of the 1870s and 1880s. These parties had emerged to challenge the liberal consensus that had characterized the Austrian government for the previous decade or so. Among the most important new parties were the Christian Social Party, which represented the German-speaking petty bourgeoisie and artisanal classes, and which was Catholic, anti-capitalist, and anti-Semitic, and the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria, which represented the urban proletariat and was socialist and internationalist. Meanwhile, the office of the minister-president, equivalent to the prime minister or chancellor, was held from 1879 to 1893 by Edward Franz Joseph Graf von Taffe, whose government was known as the Iron Ring. Taffe, you might recall, had governed largely as the head of an alliance of conservatives, federalists, and Slavic ethnic interests. The final election held with Taffe as minister-president was in 1891. The Liberals again retained a plurality with 107 mandates, but they remained outside the government. The Conservatives and Polish Club together won 137 mandates, but the Czech vote splintered over the issue of language and education initiatives being championed by the nationalistic Young Czech faction. Taffe had now lost his majority and would spend the remainder of his term in office governing weakly and tentatively. The most significant change with the 1891 election was the winning of seats for the first time by the Social Democrats and Christian Socials. While the Social Democrats' showing was relatively modest with only 1.26% of the vote, the Christian Socials entered the Reichsrat as the second largest party with nearly 40,000 votes to the Liberals' 100,000. Taffe now realized that more electoral reform would be necessary to stave off greater victories by the Christian Socials and Social Democrats. The minister-president's idea was to drop the poll tax entirely, lower the voting age, and extend the vote to any man who had completed his military service, had a job, and could read. On this last qualification, slightly less than two-thirds of Austrian men could read in 1891. Taffe hoped that, by doubling the number of urban and rural voters, the Slavic parties would grow enough to prevent hegemony by the burgeoning mass parties. However, the measure was not approved, and as a result, Taffe resigned his office and retired. After short terms of office of the ministers President Alfred III, Prince of Windisch-Gratz, and Erich Graf von Kielmansegg, Emperor Franz Joseph appointed the Polish noble Count Casimir Felix Badeni in the fall of 1895. Recognizing the difficulties he faced in governing an increasingly complex electorate, Badeni acted on a variation of Taffe's idea and recommended the addition of a fifth voters' curia to consist of all men of sufficient age who could not afford to pay the poll tax. The curia would have only 72 seats of 425 in the Reichsrat, thereby limiting its influence and mollifying outraged landowners who opposed expanding the franchise at all. When the new system was tested in March 1897, the results were mixed. On the one hand, the Slavic parties benefited enormously. The Young Czechs were now the largest party in the Reichsrat, with 3 more mandates than the Liberals, whose share of the vote fell by more than 1/4. This was the most humiliating defeat yet for the former ruling party. In addition, the Polish Club came in third place with 46 seats. The Social Democrats made a respectable showing as well, winning 14 mandates. However, the biggest winners of the election were the Christian Socials, who saw a nearly 25% increase in their vote and thus 39 mandates, making them the 4th largest party in the legislature. It is important to note the extent to which the Christian Socials had eclipsed the Völkisch nationalists by this point. While Schonerer's anti-Semitic, racially oriented German nationalist faction had experienced some popularity in the 1880s and early 1890s. By 1897, he sat in the Reichsrat alone with no faction to lead. In contrast, Christian social leader Karl Lueger won election as mayor of Vienna in 1897. And when Badeni was forced out of office before the end of 1897, which we will discuss in a moment, Franz Joseph appointed the first Christian social minister-president, Baron Paul Gauch von Frankenthurn. Clearly, the Slavic parties were not the only parties that had benefited from the latest electoral reform. Since urban suffrage across the Habsburg monarchy knew no ethnicity, the mass parties benefited as well. The Christian Socials could now make a solid claim to power. They would exert a substantial influence over the history of Austria until World War II. The remaining top 10 parties in the 1897 election consisted of landowners' parties and conservatives, as well as one newcomer. The German People's Party, called in German Die Deutsche Volkspartei and abbreviated DVP, led by Otto Steinwender, the party had split off from the Liberals in 1891 and made a direct appeal to the German-speaking Mittelstand, a term that refers here to the artisanal class primarily located in rural areas. The DVP served as the rural counterpoint to the more urban Christian socials. Although they were not totally averse to using anti-Semitic rhetoric, the DVP was comparatively more reserved in this regard than the Christian socials and substantially more so than the Völkisch nationalists. The decade that followed the 1897 election was momentous for the Habsburg monarchy. As noted, Badeni was soon out of office. The first crisis that his government faced was provoked by language reforms for Bohemia, which he supported. Some background is probably necessary. Since the Compromise of 1867 with Hungary, several ethnic groups in the Austrian half of the dual monarchy had begun to press for their own autonomy. Some began to push for a triple monarchy rather than dual monarchy, or at least greater say over life in the provinces in which they constituted majorities. In Galicia, where the majority were Poles, and Bohemia, where the majority were Czechs, these claims were most strongly made. Because of their previous cooperation in government, Taaffe wanted to retain Czech support for the Iron Ring. If he was going to be able to keep their support, it would be necessary to appease the Czechs with regard to some of their demands. With the young Czech electoral victory in the 1897 election, Badeni was now forced more than ever before to take Czech demands seriously. Chief among Czech proposals was equal status for the Czech language in Bohemia alongside German. To Badeni, this seemed to be a sensible compromise. Unfortunately for him, the German-speaking population in Bohemia saw things differently. Riots broke out in Bohemian cities as well as in cities with German majorities throughout the empire. Wherever they lived, German speakers were anxious that their status as the most elite of the ethnic groups of the Habsburg monarchy was truly in jeopardy. In addition, German-speaking legislators began to engage in obstructionism in the Reichsrat to prevent any legislation from passing. In this way, they protested what they saw as their loss of status, along with the language ordinance in Bohemia. Ultimately, the government blinked first. Franz Joseph dismissed Badeni in November 1897, and the language decrees were revoked by the end of 1899. However, none of the ministers present who followed Badeni could do much to soothe ethnic tensions. The longest single term of a minister president during this period was held by the liberal Ernest von Kerber, who focused his administration largely on economic matters. He lasted a total of 4 years in office. During Kerber's term, elections were called for December 1900. Since Austrian law required that Reichsrat seat holders be elected by a majority of voters, any race in which no candidate received a majority resulted in a runoff election between the two candidates who received the most votes. This is not an uncommon arrangement. France operates under such a system in electing its president. In the case of the 1900 election in Austria, runoff elections would be held the following month, January 1901. This election's biggest winner was the DVP. It became the largest party in the Reichsrat with 51 seats, up 20 seats from its run in 1897. The Liberals continued to lose ground, while conservatives, in alliance with clerical interests, gained 14 seats. The third major beneficiary in the election was the more radically nationalist German National Party, another splinter from the Liberals, which continued to add seats from the previous two elections when it had spun off from the DVP. Neither the Social Democrats nor the Christian Socials fared particularly well in 1900 election. The Social Democrats remained a small faction, losing 3 seats to now hold 11. Over the course of his term, Kerber would ease up on the party and allow it to run more or less openly, which would be to the party's benefit in the subsequent election. The Christian Socials lost 14 seats for a new total of 25. However, they remained highly popular in Vienna, where Luger remained mayor until his death in 1910. A few years into Kerber's term of office as minister-president, one of the more curious episodes in late Habsburg history occurred. On July 20th, 1903, Pope Leo XIII died. He had been pope for 25 years. According to the tradition of the Catholic Church, once the deceased pope had been buried, a meeting of the College of Cardinals called a conclave met in Rome to choose a new pope. The conclave convened on July 31st. The leading candidate for the papacy going into the conclave was Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, who was the Vatican Secretary of State under Leo. On the first ballot of 62 voting cardinals present, slightly less than half, or 29, voted for Rampolla. However, the Vatican rules required 2/3 of the college to vote for a candidate before that candidate could become the pope. The cardinals reconsidered their votes on the second day of the conclave and cast their second ballots, which also did not return the required 2/3 for any candidate. Many believed the third ballot to be held on the third day would be decisive and confirm the election of Rampolla as pope. However, something happened that changed the course of the conclave. One of the cardinals participating in the conclave was the Bishop of Lemberg, Prince Jan do Clan Maurice Paweł Puzina de Kosielsko. Lemberg, today a city in Ukraine called Lviv, was then the capital of Austrian Galicia. Thus, Puzina was a subject of Emperor Franz Joseph. Cardinal Puzina, acting on the explicit directions of the emperor, stated that Franz Joseph would exercise the right of jus exclusivae and veto Rampolla's election, were Rampolla to be elected pope. Jus exclusivae is Latin for right of exclusion and is often referred to as a papal veto. Austria, as a Catholic dominion, as well as France and Spain, had claimed for several centuries the right to veto a papal conclave's vote. However, this right does not appear to have been acknowledged by the Vatican until the 17th century. In that century, France and Spain used their vetoes at 4 separate conclaves. The 18th century saw 4 more vetoes, again all from France and Spain. The 19th century had been comparatively calmer, with only 2 vetoes from Catholic monarchs. France was no longer a monarchy for much of the 19th century, but Austria used its veto for the first time in 1823, with Emperor Francis vetoing Cardinal Antonio Severoli's election as Pope. Rampolla was incensed, but withdrew his name from consideration. Nevertheless, several of the cardinals rallied behind their favorite candidate and continued to vote for him on every subsequent day of the conclave, albeit in decreasing numbers. On the 7th day of the conclave, one of the other major candidates, Cardinal Giuseppe Sarto, was finally elected. He took the name Pius X. Unsurprisingly, among Pius X's many reforms of the Church was revocation of the papal veto. Over the century plus that has passed since the conclave of 1903, scholars have wondered why Franz Joseph felt it necessary to veto Cardinal Rampolla as a candidate for the papacy. We still don't really know, although there are a few theories. One possibility is that the emperor was angry at France, which under Napoleon III had supported Italian aspirations for independence against Austria. Rampolla was the favored papal candidate of the French because it was believed that he would continue Leo XIII's accommodating relationship with France. Having embraced a sort of militant secularism, France had appreciated Leo's hands-off policy regarding the Third Republic. Another possibility is that the emperor was angry about Pope Leo's activism as pope. Some feared that Rampolla, who was a protege of Leo, would continue to act more as a politician and diplomat than as a purely religious leader. Moreover, Leo had taken a fairly progressive stance against the depredations of capitalism and in favor of fair treatment of workers, while not advocating for socialism. Thus, he had likely inflamed some of the more powerful Catholics in Austria. It didn't hurt that the Pope, who was ultimately elected, Pius X, was staunchly conservative and ready to roll back social reforms within the Church. It also bears mentioning that Rampolla had been a supporter of Austria's Christian Social Party, of which Franz Joseph was not a fan. A third possibility is that the emperor was acting on behalf of Germany and Italy, since their monarchs did not have veto rights. Germany's monarch was Protestant and so disqualified for that reason. Italy's monarch, from the standpoint of the Vatican, didn't exist, since the previous popes had never recognized the Kingdom of Italy or its claims over the city of Rome. It is also possible that the emperor held long-standing resentment against Rampolla because of his son Rudolph's suicide. The emperor's son had committed suicide in 1889. Per Catholic belief at the time, those who died by suicide were not permitted to have funeral masses said for them. Rampolla, who was in a position at the time to make an exception, had refused, so perhaps Franz Joseph's veto of Rampolla's election was payback. After all, the emperor was a devout Catholic, and depriving his son of a funeral mass was something he would not have taken lightly. Finally, perhaps Franz Joseph vetoed Rampolla simply because he could. After all, the emperor's political authority had diminished over time, as had his dominions. Maybe he was just feeling his oats and wanted to flex what little muscle he had left. We'll end here for this episode. Thanks for listening.